Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm your host, Mr. O'Hagan, and as usual, I'm joined by my broadcasting partner, Mr. Zagari. How are things, Zags?
I'm good, Mr. Broadcasting partner. I like that.
Yeah.
I'm excited to pick up where we left off last time. Today on the podcast, it's Détente Part 2. We could probably use a recap, though, Mr. O. You want to start us off?
Sure, Zags. Part one of our podcast, we highlighted how, starting with JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a concerted effort by American presidents to tamp down the tensions between the U.S. and our communist adversaries, especially the Soviets. So JFK agrees to a kind of hotline with the Soviets to keep lines of communication open. LBJ continues this approach, negotiates a non-proliferation treaty on anti-ballistic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles with the Soviets in 1967.
But détente really starts under Nixon. In fact, his administration is the first to use the term to describe its policy. Is it the Nixon plan? Well, we'll reduce tensions by disarmament, open communication, and pursuing interests that are good for everyone.
But Nixon will be criticized for leaving out concerns about morality and ideology, and his successor, Ford, basically follows the same policy.
But when Carter comes into office in January of 1977, he tries to add a stronger emphasis on the importance of human rights to this policy, but he'll be criticized for misreading Soviet intentions.
And Détente and Carter, they really fall flat when the Soviets invade Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Once they invade Afghanistan, détente is over with that invasion.
Carter begins to take a harder line towards the Soviets, embargoes on grain exports, boycotting the Moscow Olympics that we talked about in the last podcast, but it's too little too late. And you couple this perceived foreign policy blunder with the Iranian hostage crisis and a stagnant economy, and Carter will lose the 1980 election badly, ushering in the Reagan presidency.
So now we are at part 3 of Détente, the 80s.
Dun, dun, dun.
So this is my era of when I was alive.
Yeah, well,
okay.
Me too.
Okay. So when Reagan comes into office, he immediately takes a much harder line against the Soviets. In one of his earliest press conferences as president, he stated that détente's been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims. He goes on to say that the goal is the promotion of a world revolution, and that has not changed since 1945. So he has clearly rejected the Nixon-Ford-Carter version of détente.
But Reagan's approach isn't without his critics either. He famously refers to the Soviet Union in 1983 as the evil empire, something even his supporters probably wished he had held back on. It just seemed unnecessarily confrontational.
Sure, but Reagan wasn't intractable. He also wants to avoid a nuclear conflict, though he's not looking to buddy up with the Soviets. Then, by the mid-'80s, he starts to alter some of his rhetoric and his goals. Well, what changed?
Reagan was moved by a number of different events. He was truly horrified by the prospect of nuclear war. Zags, you and I probably remember this as kids, but there was a TV movie called The Day After that dramatized the aftermath of a nuclear attack. And it sounds kind of cheesy, I think, in the modern era,
and
right?
Looking at it now, it's a really cheesy movie, but it scared the heck out of me.
It absolutely did. And the public outpouring of anxiety and fear reached the White House. Reagan, who, above all, understood the importance of theater and performance as a former actor, he saw the potential horror of nuclear war on television, as did millions of Americans. And I think he was definitely impacted by that.
I think that dramatization made him acutely aware of what a series of nuclear strikes would mean to the world. In 1984, Reagan proposed what comes to be known as SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative. It was mockingly referred to as Star Wars by Reagan's critics because it's of its improbable design and, of course, the popularity of the Star Wars movies. And it's just big, big money.
And SDI called for satellites to be put into orbit and fitted with lasers that could be used to shoot down incoming missiles. It was too sci-fi to be taken seriously. Look, even today, it's not a technology that's available to use.
But it did demonstrate Reagan's commitment to preventative measures. He even offered to share the technology with the Soviets if we developed it. Why bother launching missiles if everyone can shoot them down? Well, sometimes the best offense actually is a good defense. That's one way to avoid war.
Absolutely. And sometimes good luck is better than good planning, because Reagan did have the great fortune of seeing significant leadership change in the Soviet Union. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev had become the premier of the Soviet Union. He was much younger than the premiers he had followed, and he had a very healthy fear of the danger posed by a nuclear showdown. It also stands to reason that Gorbachev knew that the Soviets were not dealing from the position of strength internally that so many in the world had mistakenly attributed to them. The war in Afghanistan, the accident at Chernobyl in 1986, right? And the ongoing difficulty of providing basic consumer goods and food to the Soviet people. These were unmistakable signs of dysfunction in Soviet society by 1986.
And that's when Reagan does seek to thaw that relationship, but he's not going to turn a blind eye to what is seen as the immorality of the Soviets. He goes to Reykjavik, Iceland in late 1986 for a summit with Gorbachev, and while no meaningful agreements come out of the conference, it does set the stage for future agreements. Reagan and Gorbachev are able to build up a rapport. They see each other as potential partners. The very next year at a summit in Washington, the two men sign the INF Treaty, or the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty.
So, Zags, did Reagan pull a Nixon-Carter here and try to extend that peaceful coexistence?
No, not at all. 1987 is the same year he went to the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and famously issued his challenge that went like this. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So he made overtures to reduce that threat of military action, but he never softened his stance that communism, especially the Soviet version, was barbaric and flawed and needed to come to an end. 2 years later, in 1989, that wall would fall. What happens in Berlin happens in Germany. What happens in Germany happens in Eastern Europe.
Right. And by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. So there we are, the end of the Cold War. Zags, we've asked a lot of our listeners to stay with us over the course of 2 podcasts. So let's do a wrap-up. I think one big takeaway is that détente was not a single policy. It took on many forms under many different administrations. The underlying connection in all those policy variations and flavors is that they did seek to minimize the threat of nuclear war and reduce tensions between the West and its communist adversaries. So, Zags, how do we judge détente? To what extent was the policy of détente a success?
Wow, I love the way you channel in your inner College Board there, speaking about the evil empire beforehand.
Yeah, I know. I'm good at this, right? Yeah.
Well, you are crushing it, but I'm not sure I can even respond to that question. As you said in your commentary, détente was not an it. We'd probably be better off historically if we stopped trying to talk about it as a singular policy. Right. Some of the variations moved us in the right direction. Others did not. It is fair to say that there are many factors beyond American policy that had as much, if not more, influence on ending the Cold War. The efforts of Gorbachev, for one, the relentless pressure of Eastern Europeans, Lech Walesa in Poland, Pope John Paul II, and there were many other players in this.
I think those are great points, Zags. His historian Eric Pullen, who got a shout out on our last podcast, said the following about Reagan's role in the end of the Cold War. Reagan deserves a medal, but not a statue. In other words, he was an important contributor, but not the sole reason for the end of the Cold War. And I think the same can be said of American policy and of this notion of détente.
Well, that really is it all for today. Thanks for joining us. Take a look in the notes of this video for a link to a great collection of documents on this subject. Again, special thanks to the people at Teaching American History for this great resource.
And as always, don't forget to check out all the great videos, content spotlights, a push on the road segments, and spectacular podcasts on this YouTube channel. We'll catch you next time on the U.S. History Underground. Until then, Underground Army, dismissed.